Building a Nation, Part 3 of the American Revolution, written by Terry Miller Shannon. Focus question: how did the United States develop from 13 separate colonies to one united nation? Connections: writing. Research the Bill of Rights. Write an essay about one of these rights, explaining why it was significant to the colonists and why it is still important today. Social studies. Choose one of the first 3 presidents of the United States to research. Create a biographical poster that includes details about his childhood, education, career, and presidency. Introduction. In 1776, representatives of the 13 colonies signed the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming they were free and independent of Great Britain's rule. The colonies became a union of states called the United States of America. The new union of states needed to devise a system of government. Delegates from the states began to draft a plan for their new government. It would take 5 years to establish the plan within the new union of states because of the war with Great Britain. However, it would take another 40 years and another war with Great Britain for this new union to feel united. The Articles of Confederation. In 1777, delegates at the Second Continental Congress agreed to send the new plan for government to the states for review. The document detailing the plan would become known as the Articles of Confederation. It did not refer to the United States as a nation, but as a firm league of friendship between 13 states. The document set up a weak federal government and strong state governments. The states liked the power given to them under the Articles. The Articles of Confederation gave the federal government of the United States no power and no freedom to act. The United States had debts from the war, but Congress, the one branch of federal government created by the Articles, could not tax people to raise money to pay off the debts. The lack of power to tax would prove to be a fatal flaw in the Articles of Confederation. More flaws would be seen in the next few years, including that no one executive was in charge. A president was elected to oversee the proceedings of Congress, but had no power to make decisions. Congress also did not have the power to change the Articles if the Union of States decided something about the plan was not working. 9 of the 13 states had to agree to changes in the Articles. Do you know? The original 13 states displaced indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, beginning a pattern that would be repeated during the westward expansion of the 1800s. Indigenous peoples used both diplomacy and warfare to resist the efforts of European colonists to gain more of their land. However, their efforts were greatly hampered by widespread epidemics that resulted from exposure to diseases brought by Europeans. The Treaty of Paris. It took almost 5 years for all 13 states to come to an agreement and approve the Articles of Confederation. In 1781, the major fighting of the Revolutionary War ended with U.S. General George Washington's win over British General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. The war itself wasn't really over for 2 more years. Representatives from the United States and Great Britain discussed peace terms in Paris, France, from the middle of 1782 until the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. Only then was the war officially over. The peace treaty established 2 important ideas. 1, it recognized the new United States as an independent country. 2, it set the borders of the new United States. It included all land from the Atlantic Ocean west to the Mississippi River, with the exception of New Orleans and the Floridas, which Spain controlled. The United States northern border was set at the Great Lakes and along the borders of Quebec and Nova Scotia. Dividing up a continent. European colonization of North America was driven largely by a desire for wealth. War between the Ottoman Turks and the Mongol Empire disrupted the trade routes between Europe and Asia in the 1500s. The loss of profitable trade led many European powers to seek out new westward trade routes to Asia by sea. Between 1565 and 1625, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands all established colonies in North America. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, that ended the American Revolutionary War, divided land between the United States and Great Britain with no regard for the rights of indigenous peoples who had lived in those lands since before recorded history. Money problems. Once the Revolutionary War was over and the Treaty of Paris signed, the United States had terrible money troubles. The government had no money and no power to tax, so many of the soldiers were not paid. But an even bigger money headache faced the new nation: war debts. The nation owed more than $76 million to foreign countries, individual Americans, and state banks. Leaders did not know how they would raise the money to pay off the debts. In Massachusetts, money problems inspired a rebellion. Some farmers who fought for independence lost their farms. They were imprisoned because they could not pay their debts. In 1786, Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War captain, and about 1,000 other people marched on the town of Springfield, Massachusetts, and then headed to Boston. The U.S. Army met them there, and gunfire was exchanged. Some of the workers were tried and hanged, while others were not punished. Shays' rebellion made it clear to leaders that a stronger federal government was needed. Constitutional Convention. To solve the many problems of the United States, 55 men arrived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for a meeting at Independence Hall in May 1787. The goal of the meeting was to change the Articles of Confederation to make a stronger federal government. The men drafted a constitution that would establish a president to lead the Union, give Congress the power to tax, and create a way to change the governing document. 12 of the 13 states sent delegates. Each delegate was an influential leader in his own state, and those most involved in creating the new Union are sometimes called the founders. All the delegates were wealthy, educated white men, a reflection of the fact that only white men with property were allowed to vote in most states at that time. They elected George Washington to oversee the meeting, which became known as the Constitutional Convention. The convention lasted for several weeks. Debates over revisions to the Articles of Confederation raised tempers on two issues. The first issue was representation. More representatives in Congress would equal more power. Two plans were proposed. One based representation on population, which meant more representatives for states with more people. The other plan made representation equal for all states. The second issue was slavery. Enslaved people were black people brought from Africa or their descendants who were treated as property. Enslaved people were forced to live without freedom, often in terrible conditions, and to work without pay. Southern states wanted to ensure that they could retain the institution of slavery. They also wanted to have enslaved people counted for representation, even though enslaved people had no rights and could not vote. The delegates for the Southern states thought that by counting enslaved people for representation, their states would be on more equal footing with the Northern states. The delegates developed the 3/5 compromise on both representation and slavery. For representation, they created 2 houses of Congress. In the Senate, all states would be equally represented. In the House of Representatives, States would be represented based on their population. On the issue of slavery, the delegates prohibited Congress from making any changes to control slavery for 20 years. They also agreed to count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person when deciding how many representatives each state would get. Delegates also debated how much power the president should have. They developed a system of checks and balances to give each branch of the government equal power. 3 branches were proposed in all: a legislative branch with 2 houses of Congress, an executive branch with a president, and a judicial branch with a system of courts to enforce laws. A system to change the Constitution was also built into the document. Thinking critically, why did the delegates compromise on so many issues to create the Constitution? What were the effects of compromising? On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates of the convention signed the Constitution and sent it to the states for a vote. People everywhere discussed whether the Constitution made a good plan for government. A group called the Federalists worked to get states to ratify the Constitution. Another group, called the Anti-Federalists, worked against it becoming the law of the land. The Anti-Federalists said the Constitution needed to list the people's rights that could not be taken away by the government. Eventually, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists reached an agreement that included 10 changes to the Constitution, which were called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights guaranteed the right to free speech, freedom of religious practice, freedom from a state religion, and other rights. Liberty for all? In the first U.S. presidential election, in 1789, only white, landowning men had the right to vote in most states. Since the Civil War, the United States has amended the Constitution, expanding the right to vote several times to people of all ethnicities, women, and any citizen over the age of 18. However, many people argue that discrimination in voting rights laws unfairly impacts people of color and remains a serious issue in many parts of the country today. Under the new Constitution, George Washington was elected President of the United States of America. He took office on April 30th, 1789. He served 2 four-year terms as president. Washington named Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton's plan to fix the nation's money problems included taxes on imports and the first national bank. Hamilton's plan seemed to restore faith in the government and stimulated growth in the economy. John Adams was elected the second President of the United States in 1796. The third was Thomas Jefferson in 1801. Arguments over land. Another problem that faced the new country was how to divide up the enormous amount of land the United States gained after winning the Revolutionary War. State governments claimed lands to the west, even though they had been inhabited by indigenous peoples since before recorded history. Some areas were claimed by several states at one time. The Land Ordinance of 1785 spelled out how to divide the new land into townships and sections. Many sections were to be sold to settlers. Other sections were set aside for the government and public schools. In 1787, Virginia State Delegate Thomas Jefferson designed the Northwest Ordinance, which listed rules for how new states would be created in the Northwest Territory. It ensured that the United States would not hold colonies as Britain had done. The Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance set the stage for a huge westward movement of settlers in the early 1800s. To make this expansion easier, roads, canals, and railroads were built. The nation was expanding rapidly, and the new government was keeping up with the pace. Debts were being paid, and a division of power for the new government was established. The Louisiana Purchase. With all this prosperity and expansion, leaders of the United States started making plans. France held the land from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and the Port of New Orleans. U.S. citizens could not use the Mississippi River or the Port of New Orleans to move crops for trade. The United States sent word to Napoleon Bonaparte, France's emperor, to try to buy New Orleans. Bonaparte had some military setbacks in Europe, and he needed troops and money. In order to fund his war, he offered to sell not only New Orleans, but also the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. In October 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory for France's asking price and doubled the size of the nation. The purchase also added 200,000 people to the United States. The many indigenous nations living in the area did not agree to give up their land to any power. In fact, they were not even asked. Exploration and war. In May 1804, President Thomas Jefferson sent 2 Army officers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, plus a 45-member group to find a route across the continent. They were to explore the Louisiana Territory and report back. Sacagawea, a Lemhi Shoshone girl, served as an interpreter for the group and helped the expedition succeed. After more than 2 years, the group returned with journals, drawings, and hundreds of samples of plants and animals from their travels. The expedition would lay the groundwork for seizing land in the West, severely impacting the many different groups of indigenous peoples who already lived there. While Lewis and Clark explored the new western territory of the United States, an old ally, France, fought a raging war with Great Britain. President Jefferson kept the United States out of the war. When James Madison became president in 1808, he hoped to do the same. The United States would not be able to stay out of the war. British and French ships began seizing and searching U.S. ships in order to keep supplies from reaching their enemies. The British also seized the sailors on the captured ships and forced them to serve as British sailors. This made U.S. citizens subject to British tyranny once again. In 1812, President Madison told Great Britain to stop searching and seizing U.S. ships, or there would be war. Not satisfied with the response, Madison declared war on June 18, 1812. In the War of 1812, the United States did not have the ships to fight Great Britain's navy. An invasion to conquer British-controlled Canada failed. For 2.5 years, the United States remained at war with Great Britain. On December 24, 1814, the 2 countries signed a peace treaty to end the war. Thinking critically. Why do you think Americans may have felt more united during wartime with Great Britain than during peacetime? The United States engaged in one more battle against the British after the official end of the war. On January 8, 1815, Americans decisively won the Battle of New Orleans under General Andrew Jackson, who was unaware a peace treaty had been signed. Almost 300 British soldiers died. The U.S. death toll was less than 20. The victory at the Battle of New Orleans made it clear that the United States, not Great Britain, truly controlled the western part of the country. It also made U.S. citizens feel as if they had won the war. In truth, neither side was victorious. Maybe the most important outcome was that the late victory made the new United States of America feel truly united as one nation.